The one thing I've been doing a lot lately, and enjoying come to think of it, is debunking myths, like that Beyond Belief show from the 90s with Jonathan Frakes, or Mythbusters. Yeah, that's probably the better show to compare it to. Because there's always these little things that have been told so many times on an internet in recent years, they've become the truth even though they aren't. Such examples include Mazda banned for being too quick at Le Mans, and pole position at Suzuka moved to screw with Senna. But there's one thing that's been mentioned a few times in a couple of my videos that I feel I need to look more into, is whether or not Bernie Ecclestone, who is the former commercial rights holder for Formula 1, gave the UK government a donation to keep Formula 1 on the air in the 90s. And I mentioned this during my video, an updated video based around how F1 gave up smoking and ironically ruined its health. There has been no real replacement for the lost tobacco money, unless teams get sponsorship from gambling companies, and unlike football and other sports, Formula 1 has avoided these betting companies and online casinos like the plague. Force India had Sports Pacer on board, but it wasn't really a title sponsorship deal, it sort of came and went. If you're of a certain vintage, such as myself, you'll remember when Formula 1 cars were dressed up like packs of cigarettes, and in the 1990s the tobacco presence in the sport was like no other. In 1996, almost every team had some sort of association with a tobacco company. You had Williams sponsored by Rothmans, Ferrari and McLaren by Marlboro, although McLaren would switch to West in 1997. You got Jordan sponsored by Benson & Hedges, Ligier by Gauloises, Benetton by Mild 7, and that was just the ones who had title sponsorship deals. There were drivers on the grid sponsored by tobacco companies at a small level. Drivers like Ricardo Rosset at Footwork, he was sponsored by Marlboro. Luca Badeau and Andrea Montermini over at 40, also sponsored by Marlboro. Anuko Katayama at Tyrrell was backed by the Japanese Mild 7 brand, and Mild 7 did sponsor most of those Japanese pay drivers in the late 80s, early 90s. It's almost in the same way how Red Bull has its presence with the Formula 1 team at a huge level, and pretty much every other sport on the planet, but it also supports drivers everywhere. Examples include Kevin Hansen, who's a rallycross driver, and Swedish racer Michaela Kotelinski, who drives for Jenson Button's Extreme E team. As does Hansen, come to think of it. So tobacco is everywhere in the 90s. It was a bottomless pit of cash, and even the smallest teams could support themselves even on that smaller amount of sponsorship from the companies because there was so much of it. Tobacco companies also financed entire careers. Marlboro had a successful junior program before the manufacturers got involved, and that program financed the careers of drivers like Eddie Irvine, Rubens Barrichello, Mika Hakkinen and others. But there was one teeny tiny issue. Around the world, countries were starting to ban tobacco advertising of any description anywhere. Well, ban it even further anyway. You weren't allowed to advertise tobacco products on television, on billboards or in print such as newspapers or magazines, but in a lot of countries tobacco advertising through sport was somehow still fair game. Things like the Winston Cup in NASCAR, for instance. But here in the UK, it was illegal, full stop, and it had been since 1963. The French also had similar laws, so whenever Formula 1 was at Silverstone, Brands Hatch, or one of the 3 million tracks that have hosted the French Grand Prix over the years, tobacco logos were changed or removed entirely. But when the race was in Japan, or Monaco, or Australia, or wherever it was still allowed. The logos being shown on British televisions in full, despite being illegal, if any of that makes any sense. When the teams used to do that kind of thing with racing instead of Rothmans. So in the January of 1997, Bernie Ecclestone made a £1 million donation to the Labour Party, which is the left of centre party in the UK, while the Conservatives are the right of centre party. To put it into simpler terms that I think anybody can understand, Labour is sort of like the Democrats and the Conservatives like the Republicans, if we're going by the American system. But the thing is, in the January of 1997, it wasn't Labour in power. It was the Conservatives led by John Major, and Major had been in power since the 1992 general election. Well, he'd actually taken over the leadership of the Conservative Party from Margaret Thatcher in 1990, so he was already Prime Minister, but then they had another election which he won, and then it led on to 1997 with Cool Britannia and all of that stuff. But in the 1997 general election held on May the 1st, 1997, Labour won by a landslide, taking over the government of the United Kingdom. But on the 19th of May that year, Health Secretary Frank Dobson announced that the government would ban tobacco sponsorship in sports, Formula 1 included. Formula 1, as we've already established, was but also wasn't sponsored by tobacco, but this also went for the snooker, which at the time was sponsored by Benson and Hedges for the Masters and Embassy for the World Snooker Championships, which are held in Sheffield every year. Later that summer, Labour Party fundraisers began talks with Ecclestone for a second donation, but the talks were later abandoned. By whom, I'm not sure. Then in the October of 1997, Ecclestone had a private meeting with the new Prime Minister, Tony Blair. But then on the 5th of November 1997, the Labour government announced that Formula 1 would be exempt from this new proposed ban after Ecclestone threatened to withdraw the sport from Britain. Journalists then started investigating whether or not Labour had been taking more donations from Formula 1. The Labour Party admitted that the president of the FIA, Max Mosley, was indeed a Labour supporter, but they didn't divulge whether or not Bernie had been making financial contributions to the party. On the 13th of November, the Labour Party admitted that Bernie had offered the money after the election, but declined the offer. On the 11th of November, they said that they had indeed received a donation prior to the election, and on the advice of Sir Patrick Neal of the Public Standards Watchdog, they announced they'd return that £1 million to Bernie. On the 16th of November, the Prime Minister apologised on television for how the party had handled the decision to exempt Formula 1 from this tobacco ban, and apologising on television at that time wasn't really the done thing. Labour also denied any attempt to hide anything to do with this donation from the public, and the Tories called it the cash for access affair. So in response, the Labour government published the notes from a meeting with F1 bosses in the October of 1997. On the 2nd of March 1998, Bernie cashed the cheque that the Labour Party had returned to him, and Labour said that if that cheque had not been paid into his account before the cheque expired, the party would have given that £1 million to charity. For you young'uns, a cheque was like the PayPal of the day. You wrote it all on a slip of paper and you had to cash in that cheque before a certain time, otherwise it expired. You know how when you send PayPal money to somebody and they don't pay it out after 30 days, it's sent back to you. It's not that. The legislation that Labour had proposed came into effect in 2003, and over in the snooker, Embassy was given special dispensation to continue that sponsorship until 2005. I'm assuming that had something to do with the contracts that Embassy had signed with the World Snooker and Professional Billiards Association. The betting companies took over in snooker in 2006, starting with 888.com, Betfred, Betfair, Daffabet, and now back to Betfred, and that current deal expires after the 2021-2022 snooker season. But like I've said, if you watch football, snooker, darts, anything these days, pretty much anything, it's sponsored by a betting company. But the Masters, which was sponsored by Benson & Hedges, they ended that deal with Benson & Hedges in 2003 when the legislation came into effect. The 2004 Masters wasn't sponsored. Well, it didn't have a title sponsor. It was sponsored by somebody, but you know what I mean. Around this time, more and more bans on tobacco advertising were put in place across the European Union and the rest of the world. The Belgian Grand Prix was actually cancelled in 2003 because of arguments between Formula 1 and Belgium over Belgium's tobacco advertising laws. I think they didn't even want the censored liveries. It was like, this Ferrari is red, this McLaren's silver, it's still subliminal tobacco advertising, so they just cancelled the race. And by 2007, only Ferrari remained having full-blown tobacco advertising on the cars, but they could only run full Marlboro branding at Bahrain, China and Monaco, while running that barcode design that we know and recognise everywhere else. And now, at the risk of sounding like Simon Whistler, bonus fact. In the 2001 season, the big 5 tobacco brands still involved in Formula 1 at that time, which were West, Marlboro, Mild 7, Lucky Strike and Benson & Hedges, pumped in an estimated $753 million into Formula 1. And this was pre-9/11 as well, before the economy tanked, after the World Trade Center attacks, and with inflation as well, we could be looking at $1 billion. So did Bernie pay off the government? A little bit of yes, a little bit of no. It's hard to tell. He did send the Labour Party £1 million, but they weren't the government yet. The money was later returned, but rather than bribe, he probably just strong-armed the government into U-turning by threatening to pull F1 out of the UK, which today the motorsport industry in the UK makes billions every year and employs about 40,000 people across Formula 1, touring cars, TCR, even the stuff that makes the specialist equipment like X-Track with the gearboxes and stuff. However, Bernie also donated to the Conservative Party at the same time. An anonymous Tory source told a newspaper in Britain that Ecclestone had given the Conservatives 700 grand prior to that 1997 election for their war fund, or whatever they called it. For the election, not for, you know, bombing people for oil. So for Bernie, it wasn't bribing, it wasn't this, it wasn't corruption. Bernie would say it was just business. Ruthless business. It's a bit more information on this donation that Bernie Ecclestone made to the Labour Party to keep F1 on TV. Now, if you've learned something here today, then be sure to thumb up the video. And if you want more stuff like this, so debunking motorsport myths, explaining motorsport further, reacting to motorsport news, even the stuff from Formula Challenge, which you people enjoyed, so I'm going to keep on doing that, the highlights from that. Yeah, get the subscribe button clicked, get that bell on, and you'll never miss a future video. Big thanks to the patrons of Patreon who continue to support the channel, and if you want to make your own donation of £1 million to the channel, you know, I'd be forever thankful. But if you do want to donate a certain amount from $1 up to $20, or just joining the Discord chat, links to Discord, Patreon, and so on will be down in the description for you. I mean, I don't know why YouTubers continue to do this. Down below, guys. It's always been there. I know where to find the description box. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. So until then, goodbye.